Welcome to Chautauqua, where history comes alive and just won't stay in a book. Tonight's program is sponsored by Greenville Chautauqua and the Spartanburg County Public Libraries. Christine Bennett and Charity Rouse from the Spartanburg Library will be monitoring the Q&A and the tech behind the scenes. And I'm your host, Caroline McIntyre from Greenville Chautauqua. Thanks for joining us. As always at Chautauqua, there will be questions. So the way we handle questions is through the chat box. You'll find it either at the bottom, the top, or on the sides of your screen. It usually is a white, like a dialogue bubble. If you and you can just type your questions anytime during the show so you don't forget them. About 7:40 or so, we'll break for questions, so we will get to them. Also, the show is probably best in speaker view. So if you have too many heads sitting there looking at you, you may want to go up to one of the sides and find your gallery view and speaker view and turn it to speaker view. We're so excited to welcome back our founder of Greenville Chautauqua, Dr. George Frein. George is a nationally acclaimed Chautauqua performer who started in the Great Plains, Chautauqua in the mid-1980s. I think he was in 7th grade then, and that's a joke, sorry, and has performed consistently ever since. In 1999, George produced the first Greenville Chautauqua Festival, and that's just the beginning of the story. Interviewing George is our own Larry Bounds, chairman of Greenville Chautauqua Board and fellow Chautauqua performer. While George and Larry discuss the Chautauqua backstory, write down your questions in the chat box so we can answer them. And as always at Chautauqua, you are part of the show.
And with that, I'm going to jump right in and tell a story. Okay, because of my training at the feet of George Frein, I was invited to fly all the way across the Rocky Mountains to do a Chautauqua performance in the lovely town of Grand Junction. And when I arrived in Grand Junction to perform as Walter Cronkite, when I got there, the volunteer with the Chautauqua Society there who drove me around and made sure I got to shows on time and all that, she said, "How did you get started doing Chautauqua?" And I told her that I learned it from the first scholar that I saw presenting, George Frein. And she got so excited. She said, "George Frein, we consider him the gold standard of Chautauqua performers." So here I am, the other side of the country. Everybody knows George. So George, thank you very much for being with us tonight. And
Good.
Maybe you could tell us how you got started with Chautauqua.
I can, but I want to ask a question first.
Yeah.
On my screen in front of me, I see a big stripe down the middle of the screen that says this meeting is being recorded by blah, 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 blah. Can that go off, or is that going to be there?
I think you tap got it. There's a little button that says got it. And then you tap the got it button and then it should disappear.
Well, I don't see got it anywhere.
It was at the bottom of the box.
At the bottom of
At the bottom of the box in the middle of the screen, there was a box. And then at the bottom, it says got it to make your.
Aha. It was hidden.
Ah.
Aha. Very good. So you want to know how I got started?
How did you get started?
Well, I was teaching at the University of North Dakota in the Philosophy and Religious Studies department. And Clay Jenkinson, who had been doing Chautauqua, invited us to come out and see him perform. And I was impressed with his performance, but I was more impressed with the questioners. These were farmers who came to the tent to learn something, and they pursued the learning more seriously than any of my students. And they never asked the hateful question, is this going to be on the exam? They were just there to learn. And Clay asked me to apply next year when they were doing Travelers on the Plains. And I said, I'm coming up for tenure, Clay. I don't think pretending to be a dead person on a Chautauqua stage going to help with the tenure. But he persisted, and I applied, had to submit a video. And in the video, I asked myself the question about evil and answered it. And he thought that was very daring. and he dared me to do it on the stage. Anyway, I went out as a traveling Jesuit missionary in the West, the most traveled man in the whole history of the Western United States. And then after that, I got invited to do Henry Adams and Herman Melville and Mark Twain and so on. Anyway, I got started as an outreach program at the university. We were all required not only to teach and research, but also to serve the public as best we could. And this was a perfect way to do that. So that was and that was in 1986, long time ago.
Wow. So I know I looked up your first Father Pierre Jean de Smet. So how come we never saw the Father de Smet here in Greenville?
He never appeared in Greenville. I did him in Boulder, Colorado more recently, in the last 4 or 5 years, because they were doing a Western theme. We just never did the Western theme much. And anyway, Twain is a better Western theme presenter even than de Smet. And his treatment of Native peoples was very kind and very generous, and he prayed with them. He did the sweat lodge with them, but he wanted to convert them too. And that gets problematic for modern audiences. In fact, it's problematic. They had a building when I was at St. Louis University, and the history department was in the de Smet building. He was a greatly revered man, but they finally took his name down from the building at complaints of Native students. And that's an interesting question because our characters are always good and not so good. They have problems. I once did Chautauqua with a woman who was very good, but she never found a fault in her character. And she was asked that one time. And when she said, oh, I don't see any, the whole audience laughed because in her program, she demonstrated the principal fault of her character.
When I was doing Jackson a year or two ago, I did Andrew Jackson.
Yeah.
Of course, a stalwart man, highly admired in America in so many ways. And of course, with the entire Indian conflict, what I found is the best way to communicate the fact that in character, he saw nothing wrong with it was I read a letter that he wrote. And I just read his words from his letter, and the audience response is just horrified. And he's so proud of every word of it.
Yeah. Well, the backstory, though, Larry, reaches way far back beyond the two of us. It goes back to 1874 with the founding of the Chautauqua movement in Lake Chautauqua, New York, as a school for Sunday school teachers. But within 2 years, it had become a general education program and the most popular adult education program in the history of the country to this day. Hundreds of thousands of people flocked to upstate New York. We have no idea how hungry the country was for learning and education. And our ancestors far surpassed us in that regard, I think. And it got to be so demanding that towns all across the country set up Chautauquas, almost 1,000 of them. And then pretty soon the tent Chautauquas came along, and they traveled, every 15 miles down the railroad track, pitched a tent and ran a program. And they also provided college girls to babysit your kids during the day so you could attend all the programs. Well, that brought every farmer in the region into the program. And then it died out. It almost, I think, committed suicide, because when movies and other forms of entertainment came along, Chautauqua decided, instead of upping the intellectual content of itself, of its program, it would up the entertainment quality, and it couldn't compete, of course, with movies. Anybody who's been to one of our Chautauquas knows that we're pretty poor entertainment, dramatic entertainment compared to people on the screen. So it died out in 1932. I remember that date very clearly because I was born that year, just a few months after the last Chautauqua folded its tent and went away, and it stayed gone for quite a while until the National Endowment for the Humanities was set up in 1965 by Congress, and they put a Chautauqua, they put a humanities council in every one of the 50 states, and they all looked for different ways to get humanities out to the general public. Congress was wise. They didn't give any money to humanities in the colleges. Why? Because they knew it would go down the same drain that all the other money in the colleges went down. So they insisted that college profs teach not in college, but in the public. And in North Dakota, Everett Albers said, we're going to reestablish the old time Chautauqua. And he did. He sent college profs out to lecture, but in the second season, he said, you can't do that lecture stuff anymore. That's too boring. You've got to portray the people you're lecturing about. And boom, audiences went from 30 to 300 night after night for the Chautauqua week when Chautauqua was in town. And then in 1981, the states of North and South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas formed the Great Plains Chautauqua Society. And we traveled there. I joined them in '86 for the whole summer. It was a wonderful summer.
Now, I picture the Great Plains, vast expanses of great blue skies and all that. So you would travel like from one show to the next, hundreds and hundreds of miles?
Oh, yes. We drove back and forth. We opened in southwestern Kansas for a week. Next week, we drove to southeastern Kansas, then to southeastern Nebraska, and so on, zigzagging up. We followed the harvesters as went north through the fields of wheat. Was a great time. And we traveled in a van of 5 or 6 scholars, and none of us knew each other's colleges, so we couldn't do what profs usually do, and that is talk local politics. We had to talk about the humanities. It was always a great way to get an education. Everybody
were those tent shows as well? Did you guys carry a tent to set up, or did you have to use facilities?
Yes. No, we traveled with a tent, 600 chairs, a sound system, a motorcycle for the driver of the 18-wheeler that pulled us along. So he didn't have to hear the programs. He could drive his motorcycle around. Anyway, it was a great experience. And I got to know people all over the Great Plains that I never would have otherwise.
So we come to the 90s, and you have been touring the Great Plains, and you suddenly end up in the little town of Greenville, South Carolina.
I did.
How did you jump from North?
The first thing I had to do when I got to town, before I could unpack my books or my furniture, was get on a plane and fly to Massachusetts to do a Chautauqua there in Western Massachusetts. Shelley was not too happy that I didn't spend a week in the new house, but I couldn't even get my books. So when I got to the airport to fly to Massachusetts, I had to find something to read on the plane, and I found A.V. Huff's History of Greenville. And in there, he described the old-time Chautauqua that pitched a tent on North Main near Academy. And when I got home from that Chautauqua, I went to see him. And I said, how'd you like Chautauqua to come back? He said, you're kidding. But I persuaded him, and Judy Bainbridge, his assistant dean, took me out, sat me down on a bench in Furman University, and we plotted the first Chautauqua that would happen that next summer, 1999. And in the paper that we printed, the companion reader, the top line after Greenville Chautauqua is "A tradition returns." And indeed, the tradition did come back. And it came back as the American humorists. When 5 of us retired from the Great Plains, we set up a program that would allow us to travel the country and do Chautauqua wherever we would be welcomed. And we started out going to Delaware and flying to California, and I don't know where else. But those people, we did the program, American Humorists. And we had hired a Baltimore caricaturist, Tom Chuckley, to draw the cartoon. And maybe we can look at those early cartoons because I think they give us a nice backstory. There's the first one. And on the left in California is Will Rogers, Mark Twain sitting next to him, James Thurber, Langston Hughes, and Dorothy Parker. And we performed that Chautauqua behind the Peace Center. The problem, it was a nice setting in Greenville, except that the air conditioners for the enormous Peace Center auditorium turned on just about the time we were ready to start talking. So it was less than ideal. But the nice thing about those caricatures, which have kept on from this beginning in 1999 to the present, is that it tells us what we're going to do. We're not going to give you a picture of the character we present, but an interpretation, a caricature, if you will. And then the next year, in the next slide, please, we decided we should do Southern writers. And there are the Southern writers. Mark Twain was a Southern writer and Southern critic in that program. Zora Neale Hurston, Thomas Wolfe, Faulkner. And then the next year, we went back to the American Renaissance, a program that we had done. And my character was Herman Melville, and here is Celia Stewart's caricature. It's the only year that we didn't use Tom Chuckley because we already had these caricatures. And they, I think, offer an interesting insight into the character. Caroline, I know, says she doesn't really understand the theme until Chuckley does his caricatures, and there's some merit to that. And the next slide is the Conceived in Liberty. It's this one that made us go to Asheville to the libraries because the North Carolina Humanities Council wouldn't fund a program, Conceived in Liberty, because a board member argued successfully that we were not conceived in liberty, we were conceived in intolerance and slavery. And we should be more nuanced and complex than just conceived in liberty. Anyway, the next year, we went on to a program of that we called, what was it? The Examined Life, going all the way back to the ancient Greek philosophers. The unexamined life they thought was not worth living. And the examined life, of course, produces autobiographies. And so we have here 6 autobiographies. And I understand that Pauli Murray, who's next to Eleanor Roosevelt in that caricature, is going to be a character again next year in Greenville.
Something I notice about all the pictures is there is male, there's female, different time periods, different races, different positions, politics. How does I assume that there's a concerted effort to get a variety of voices. What do you look for in actually putting that together?
It is, we believe in equality in this country, but if you go to a literature book that's used in colleges or that you used in your classes, Mark Twain gets a whole bunch of pages, and Langston Hughes gets a few. But in Chautauqua, everybody gets one night. Langston Hughes gets one night, Dorothy Parker gets one night, Mark Twain gets one night, Will Rogers gets one night. It kind of equalizes things and is a bit of a reform long before the race theory that is now controversial. We deliberately set out to always include a woman character, sometimes many more than that. But American history does not feature women as much as it does men. You got to dig a little bit. And the same with African Americans and Native Americans. And so we make a concerted effort to get a theme that reaches across a broad band of important people. And many people like Pauli Murray, who did the research that overthrew the Board of Education Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. She was
Brown versus you mean Brown versus the Board of Education?
Right. Sorry, yes, which overthrew Plessy, and an important figure, and to bring her back was, I think, a contribution to the discussion that has now, she's now the subject of a wonderful new documentary.
Having this variety of characters, some of them very popular still. I mean, Mark Twain seems to always be a popular, he's funny, he's clever, he's sardonic. Have you ever had characters that were so controversial that you expected problems? Did problems ever come up with highly controversial characters?
Well, strangely enough, Abraham Lincoln was a controversial character in the American South that we moved from Massachusetts to Greenville. And I remember getting some pretty tough questions in the character of Abraham Lincoln. Yes, I think every character, every good character is controversial in some way or other. Twain was a very bitter critic of Southern literature. He says, Southern literature is sentimental. It's out of date with I mean, Walter Scott was so influential in the South that we can blame him for starting the Civil War. And he has a wonderful story about an African-American woman that is just a wonderful sketch. And she was the woman who taught him to listen to the voices of his childhood. And so what a wonderful contribution to, I mean, we wouldn't have Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn unless he had learned from that woman who he was. Yeah.
In your experience with Chautauqua, have you ever seen, because you've done this across the country, have you ever had audiences that became confrontational, or someone in the audience becomes confrontational?
Oh, I think so. Doug Mishler from Arizona picks controversial characters. He did Khrushchev, for example. Trouble is, he won over the American audience. He'd have made everybody in that audience communist if they had to vote after his presentation. Although there was one person who stood up and shouted at him a little bit, but that only made him more lovable by the rest of the audience. But I think, beyond that, every human being is controversial. If you don't raise a controversy, if you don't irritate somebody, you're not living up to your potential. I mean, there's something about us, and we argue with ourselves. And that's one of the things that Chautauqua wants to do is to get people to argue with themselves. You want to get a Democrat to argue with the Republican hidden deep inside it. So to get the Catholic to argue with the Jew deep inside himself. Everybody has those kinds of moments, those times. And if Chautauqua works, it gets that kind of conversation going, and somebody will raise a hand and ask a question, sometimes by that minor voice, sometimes by the major voice. And once in a while, if you listen long enough to people, you can spot the inner conflict and help them facilitate it.
Well,
I think
I remember when I first saw you in 2001, you were doing Herman Melville, though of course in the actual performance you were not staring into a bottle.
No.
But as I saw you, I remember I'm teaching English at high school, at Wade Hampton High School here in Greenville. It's my first year teaching English there at Wade Hampton. And I see the article in the paper about Herman Melville is going to be at the Greenville Downtown Library, which was the old building, not the new building, but the old building. And I went over there to have a chance to hear Herman Melville, because during a summer I had read Moby Dick fairly recently and enjoyed it immensely. But when I got there and I saw you had your beard, you were in character, you did your show. There were only about a dozen of us sitting around that conference room table when you did your show. And within very short time, you would have hundreds gathering at the library for our shows. But that night there were maybe a dozen people, and you did this. And I remember in detail your presentation of like chapter 1 of Moby Dick, much of it, in fact, all of it from memory, and how you made me realize, even though I had read it, you made me realize how funny Moby Dick is. It was great, the humor. And it was an element of the book that I had never noticed. And it was clear.
Well, I think most of us come to books like Moby Dick going, this is very serious. This is a great classic. You know, this got to be grave, and gravitas needs to be brought to it. And we miss the first joke I think it's the 3rd page of Moby Dick is about a fart, and it just goes by. Most of us don't pick up the allusion unless we slow down. And of course, you don't want to slow down reading Moby Dick because it's such a long book. But what I remember, Larry, is that you brought students to those discussions in the library, and they were very small, but they were very, very good and very detailed. And that came. There's a backstory to that library program, because when I was with the Great Plains, we went to a town in far western Nebraska, tiny, tiny little town. And we got the best questions we ever had over the last 3 or 4 years. And so I said to somebody, this is an amazing town of people who read and know and ask wonderful questions. They said, oh, that's due to the librarians. We got 2 old librarians who are unhappy that people don't come in bigger numbers to the library. So they ran a series of book discussions during the winter before you guys came in the summer. And that's why the questions are so good. So I thought, well, if it works in Western Nebraska, it'll work in South Carolina, it'll work anywhere. So the library discussions became very important preparation. And there's always a backstory to something like that. And Chautauqua seems to have a lot of them, I think.
So I noticed as I was looking up your particulars that you have your bachelor's in philosophy, your master's in history, and your PhD in theology. And of course, you were a professor of philosophy and theology. So as a Chautauqua performer, which has stood best for you? Which of those disciplines has worked out to be the best in your interpretations?
Well, as you know, in the United States, discussing religion has got to be pretty sophisticated. Otherwise, you alienate all kinds of people, make the Baptists happy with you and the Methodists unhappy, or however it goes. So my tendency is to do more philosophical sorts of things. But I'm always interested when I'm reading, say, reading Moby Dick or Huckleberry Finn, looking for those places in the texts where the text should raise a philosophical question. And then I ask myself, where else in Twain or Melville or whoever I'm reading is this question to be found? And I'm always looking for a question that is history related, question that's literature related, question that's philosophy related. If I can work in jurisprudence or some other humanities discipline or history of art history, I'm happy to do so, because our Chautauqua, unlike the old predecessors, is a humanities Chautauqua. We do it for the sake of the humanities, to get people thinking about themselves as human beings. And once I was on the stage in South Dakota, and somebody asked a question, and I said, look, I'm just going to think out loud for a minute. You ask about human beings, and that's a good question. We need to ask a lot of questions about human beings, but we can't let the category being dominate or be the only category for our thinking. Let's think about ourselves as human becomings. We may get closer to who it is we are because we're on a journey, we're on a roll, we're going someplace. We're not just being in a place. And in fact, being someplace might interfere with the more important thing of being somewhere else, being in a better place, being in a more human place. And so we had a wonderful discussion, and then I went home and wrote something about it and thought about it. But I think that served the humanities. And you learn so much from audiences, and audiences are so much a part of this. I was telling somebody recently that doing Melville one time, I had to tell a story about the throwing of a harpoon. And so I stood up and I dramatized throwing, obviously pretend, invisible, non-existent harpoon, and I threw it out and I saw an audience member duck. And I thought, oh, this works. People will get caught in a story. That's the magic. You do magic and you kind of downplay. There's no such thing as real magic. It's illusion. I remember your Houdini lecture, and but I think you believe that there's magic in words. Words take us to the human condition wonderfully, and that's what the humanities are just built out of words. And I would argue that we're all built out of words.
Well, so as you have traveled and done these, or even specifically in the Greenville area, did you remember any events that surprised you, questions that surprised you as they came up from the audience?
Oh dear, just all kinds of very thoughtful questions. Questions about the American past were always being asked, and various periods of time were being asked. The most memorable one was before that I have the value of a week-long Chautauqua was really before I came to Greenville, and it demonstrated for me how these characterizations can really work when they work well. And that was when we were doing Visions of America. And the first night Thomas Jefferson gave his vision. What a wonderful, wonderful vision it was of small farmers who lived close to the earth and were the soul of America. Next night, Alexander Hamilton came on. He said, "The heck with the small farmer. We need commerce in this country. We need to grow the country and to develop its commercial potential." And then the third night, Abigail Adams came on. I was on stage to introduce her and to moderate the program. And after her program, I came up and asked for questions. And somebody said, I have a question because I've been here since Monday night. And on Monday night, I knew it was Jeffersonian. Until Tuesday night, when I knew, no, that was a romantic sort of vision, and not real. I'm really a Hamiltonian. Now, Miss Adams, Abigail Adams, I want to ask you, were the Adamses Jeffersonian or Hamiltonian? And she just bristled and she said, my dear sir, we were neither Jeffersonian nor Hamiltonian. We are the Adamses. And our vision is not a vision of small farmers for the country or commercial enterprise. We want a republic of virtue. And I thought, there is perfect. Remember those questions on your humanities exams? Compare. And students always groan when they get those questions, but that's the natural, there's no such thing as anatomy, only comparative anatomy. No such thing as literature, only comparative literature. And no such thing as humanity except comparative, I think. And that more than any other story stuck with me because it demonstrated how humanity's characters next to each other can enrich our thinking about the past and the present and the future.
And of course, there's that wonderful transition in the questioning that goes from the questioning in character to the questioning out of character. And I remember when Eleanor Roosevelt, in character in Greenville, was asked about her husband's affair. And she responded in character with the most scathing put down of this woman. How could anyone in a state as well known as South Carolina for its good manners and taste ask such a thing? And I felt so sorry for that poor woman. But then, of course, when she went out of character, she spun back to that same person and said, please ask me that same question again, and I'll give you all the dirt.
She did.
And she did. So when a Chautauqua performance is going on in character, how is it so different than out of character? How do you see that transition?
People often ask, do you become Mark Twain or whoever? I said, no, I never do that. Actors may do that. I don't know how to do it. I'm not interested in doing it. I always want to keep a distance between myself and my character. I don't want to fall in love with the character. I don't want to become the character. Don't want to have the character's prejudices, but have my own. So I think that the monologue is also a critical piece of work, as are the questions in character. But out of character, of course, you can be very blunt and say, remember when Twain told that story? That was a lie. He was not telling the truth at that time. And that's important because we need to be critical of the character and not sanctify the character. And I would think for you it'd be kind of difficult to do when you're doing Houdini. I remember your first Houdini performance in Greenville. I was sitting behind a row behind a young kid, he might have been 10, and his father. And every time you did a magic trick, the kid would look at his father and say, wow. And then he'd look back again. And there was no distracting him. He was totally possessed by Houdini and his magic. I think your separation from Houdini in the out of character presentation is always so surprising to the audience because you're not a believer in magic. It's all trickery.
Well, Houdini himself would start his show by telling the audience that nothing he accomplished is done by supernatural means, that he used the greatest of all keys, the human mind, to master his escapes. So he would be the man who would take credit. He would make sure that you didn't give credit to any supernatural power because he wanted all the credit for himself.
For himself, right? Well, you know, John Adams, thinking of that, Adams went to Philadelphia for the meeting of the Continental Congress. It was the first time he'd been out of Massachusetts. And took him days to get down there, of course. And he wrote back to his wife that he felt really unprepared. He wanted more time to study. He wasn't ready. I mean, he was a lawyer, he's a Harvard graduate and so on, but he needed more time to study. And I picked that up. It just castaway line in a letter because it was heartfelt, I think, on his part. And it seems to me that when they established the Continental Congress and began the nation, they began it with people like Adams, who weren't really ready. They needed more study. He needed more time to read. And we're still at that. Franklin, of course, famously said it's a republic if you can keep it. But how do you keep it? And Adams' answer would be, keep studying, keep reading, keep working that mind. That's as Houdini said, that's the supernatural.
Yeah. I think we may have some questions out there.
Okay.
So let's open up the
Breaking into this, yes, there are quite a few people in your audience need to know a lot of things, George. And Larry, you can join in too. Two of the same question, one from Gary Butterball, and another person. Why did you move to Greenville? What drew you to this area of the country? And did I miss it? For George, what made you come from the Dakotas to the Northern Plain and the Northern Plain Chautauqua movement to Greenville?
Well, I married a North Dakota woman, and she got a job in Massachusetts for 1 year, teaching at Tufts University. And then she got an offer from Furman, and she said I could come along if I behaved myself. We're going to the South now, and you'll have to behave. And so I did, and I said, well, okay, but I've got to continue to do Chautauqua. And when I got to Greenville, I looked around and it looked like a Chautauqua kind of town, and the people were certainly delightful and just wonderful to work with. So I was dragged to South Carolina.
There's a gentleman in the audience who was at our first performance behind the Peace Center. And he says that it's Seth Harrison.
Seth, yes.
Didn't have a program or anything, but it was Charles Pace as Langston Hughes that caught his attention when he showed up at the amphitheater. And I believe Charles is on this call with us too. So,
you know what I remember about that program was the difficulty of it. All the programs were set for 7 o'clock, except Charles's Langston Hughes, which was 6:30 because the orchestra was setting up behind him while he was doing the program. And at 7:15 or so, they were going to come on. So Charles is a trooper. He works through all kinds of thunderstorms and difficulties as a real professional. And he did that night. He had people like Seth Harrison laughing at Langston Hughes. I asked Charles, we were thinking about doing a program on American humor, but my knowledge of African-American history was not good enough for me to name a humorist, certainly not in the league with Thurber and Parker and Twain and Will Rogers. So I called Charles. He said, oh, Langston Hughes. I mean, it took him about a nanosecond to identify the wonderful humorist that he then worked very hard to portray. And Hughes was a complex humorist because he was a great poet and a great writer, as well as a great humorist. And he made, I think, people laugh at their prejudice and therefore admit it a little more than they had up to that point.
How long does it take to thoroughly prepare to represent a historic figure? And are there some that are easier to prepare for than others?
Yes, it takes at least a year. People like Melville and Twain, whose books are like this, take longer, really. But I got Dr. Seuss together in a year, though he wrote as many books, more books than Melville, and almost as many as Twain. But his books were just a little bit easier. You could read a dozen of them in a day. But it does take a lot of preparation, and that's the backstory that we don't want the audience to see. I remember once when I was a kid playing the violin, and the teacher said, "Well, you played that all right, but it was so much work." and your audience does at the recital doesn't want to see how hard it is. They want to see how delightful it is, how easy it is. And so we need to get the character to the point where he just goes out and talks. You know, it's no big amount of labor.
If you were a female, what character would you like to portray?
Ooh, I have one.
Okay, I'm going to let you
I have
answer
pitched-
that because
I
you've got
have-
more courage than I do.
I have pitched this and been thoroughly rebuked because it probably is not a great idea. But if there was one female character that I would play, it would be Mae West. I would love to do Mae West. You're going to expect the wigs and the padding and all that, but what a wit, what a sassy, sarcastic, and brilliant woman. She was a playwright. She wrote her own movies. She defied the censorship laws. She was wonderful. And there are many men who dress up as Mae West to this day. So it wouldn't be that unusual, but there's not been much of an audience for me to get dressed up as Mae West.
That is an eloquent and wonderful and believable answer. And I'm not going to follow it by
A comment from Ed Sherry in Asheville. George, our first Asheville program was Southern Writers in 2000. So the Buckham Library has been aboard since that second year.
yeah, that's
Sorry, I was interrupted.
that's right. They have. I went to the humanities office in North Carolina and just knocked on the door and started talking about Chautauqua. And the director said, "Let's have lunch." And over lunch, he agreed to bring it to North Carolina. The first 5 years in South Carolina, the Humanities Council funded the program, at least funded that part of it that went to the stipends for the scholars.
A couple other questions about the history of Chautauqua. This is a couple questions together. I've been to the Chautauqua in New York, and I know someone else is talking about the Lakeside, Ohio Chautauqua. What is the difference between Greenville Chautauqua, New York on the Lake Chautauqua, and Lakeside, Ohio in Lake Erie?
Oh my, well, Chautauqua was a very generous program. Miller, the founder, said anybody can use the name Chautauqua as long as they do something good. And so people picked it up. It was very popular. And as I said, people were interested in education, particularly those that had moved out of the East, out to the small villages in the West and the Midwest. And they went to Chautauqua, bought tickets and attended these and looked forward to them year after year. And they were more or less, some places more, some places less, than interested in education than the mother Chautauqua in New York. But, you know, once a Chautauqua and an instructor in Chautauqua, as well as a performer, all performers are instructors, of course, always performer, and that was true of Dolly McIntyre. I remember the second year of the year that Doug Watson was doing Nathaniel Hawthorne. And we went down to the Coffee Underground the next morning to have coffee and sit around and talk with people who'd been to Chautauqua the night before. And Dolly had a dental appointment, so she came late. But when she came, finally, we were only about a half hour into our discussions, and everybody was talking. Before she sat down, she pointed at Doug and she said, "Young man, you need to project more forcefully." And she was right. But it was a charming moment with Dolly that I always remember.
And of course, Dolly is like you said earlier, was one of the early board members for the Greenville Chautauqua. But more importantly, perhaps, is the fact that she had actually performed in the tent shows Chautauquas that toured the country back in the 30s, right?
Yeah, where she met her husband,
who happens to be the mother and father of a certain people that should hopefully be watching and participating, that we heard her voice just a few moments ago. Sally Petoskey and Caroline McIntyre, who are the daughters of Chautauqua, in effect, the daughters of Chautauqua.
So it's nice to have that connection.
Getting back to the audience, which character that you do is the most difficult for you to do?
Oh dear. You want to go first?
Okay, I'll go first. And it's part of what you said before about the volume of what you read to be ready. Even though this is also my most favorite character to perform now, Winston Churchill. The volumes of Winston Churchill work, and it's ongoing. There is constant publication in aspects of the life of him. And the reason he is my favorite to perform is I could take, of the dozen or so people that I have been fortunate enough to perform as, there is something about each of them that Churchill also did. I do Houdini, the escape artist. Well, Churchill escaped from a South African prison and made his way across the continent of Africa. Every single person, I've done Thomas Cole with you, as Audubon and Thomas Cole and all that. I did Thomas Cole the painter. Churchill's an eminent painter, so he would be my favorite. He's also the hardest, but he's great and he's funny and smart.
Herman Melville, I guess, is my most difficult one, because not only did he write Moby Dick, but he wrote very difficult other novels. Hawthorne said in one, he makes you swim for your life. What's at stake reading that book as you're living or dying? He also wrote the longest poem in the English language about a young theology student who lost his faith and made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to recover it and failed in the attempt. He wrote a collection of poems on the Civil War that are very challenging. Nothing like a bullet can undeceive, he said about fighting in a war. Once you get shot, you kind of see things for what they are. But I am not a sailor. I don't like the ocean. I don't feel comfortable around it. And to imagine living outside of the sight of land for 4 years is really difficult. So wrapping my head around him is harder than Twain. I'm from Missouri. I can do Truman and Twain without even trying to put on an accent.
From Betty Parker Ellis, what obstacles did you have to overcome to launch and promote Greenville Chautauqua now that we're over 20 years in existence and starting it? What was hard?
Well, finding money is always hard, and finding the way to generate it. I enjoy with the Great Plains Chautauqua Society writing two major grants, about $500,000 each for two programs there, one on the Gilded Age and one on the American Renaissance. And I came to say that grant writing is my favorite literary genre because you really get something out of it if you win it. So I was able to write grants for the South Carolina Humanities Council in Columbia and visit with them and bring home the wherewithal to get things started. It still required a great deal of input by generous people in Greenville, and they were very, very generous. But it did depend on some kind of way of funding it, and still does. I know it's difficult for you today.
Anything else that's hard? There was any other obstacles that you, besides the funding?
Well, the scholars were not a problem at all. People were happy to do Chautauqua. I remember Pat Grills talking to him on the phone, and I said, I'm going to describe a strange sort of project to you. You can stop me at any time that you say, you're not interested, but I'm calling to ask you to do a Chautauqua character. He never did say stop. And he became a wonderful Chautauquan and appeared, I think, for the first time, he and Larry together in a program on the Civil War. Somebody once said, doing Chautauqua, he said, if you can't find anything better to do the Civil War, it's always a winner.
I think that we've combined most of the questions. If you still have a question, go ahead and write it, but I think I'll turn it back to our two people to give your conclusions.
So we've talked a lot about the past, as Chautauquans often do. What about what's going on now? I know you're working once again with the North Dakota Chautauqua. You mentioned it up front about this new program you're developing. So what's new in the world of Chautauqua?
Well, we're doing a Chautauqua Training Institute, which will be a year-long course for 10 selected scholar students who are going to develop characters. We're going to work with them for a whole year, meeting every month. And there are 4 of us on the faculty. And we hope to grow Chautauqua to have more characters. We have one who submitted a proposal to do Eastman, the Native American surgeon who was at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, who was one of the founders of the Boy Scouts. He could have programs all around the country, going to scouting jamborees and meetings and taking the scouts back to that time and place and show what a Native American has contributed to American culture, which nobody knows about for all practical purposes. I mean, he's got a page in Wikipedia, but he's not as well known as he should be. Larry?
I know here in Greenville, the pandemic has changed things a lot. We didn't do any in-person live shows after the Winter Chautauqua in 2020, because after the Winter Chautauqua in early February, then everything went off. And so our 2020 show moved to 2021, though we began supplementing it with programs like this one, where we have online video. And luckily, we've been able to actually perform more for the community because of programs like this than we were able to present before. We're hoping to be back for this coming year's Winter Chautauqua, and we have arranged to have the performance by the noted French chef, Julia Child. There, the name finally popped back. So wow. Julia Child, you know who is performing Julia Child. I'm sure you have worked on shows with her before. She's done Chautauqua for a long time. And I am once again reaching for her name, though I have done shows with her, so I should know her name really well. The Caroline,
Susan
who's
Karen
Who?
Veranche.
Karen
Karen
Veranche.
Oh,
Karen
yes.
Veranche.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. Karen's
So
wonderful.
we will hopefully be having that in February, and then knock wood, hope for the best. We'll continue our videos, our monthly online programming, but so we've added more to the mix, but we're hoping to be back at least part of the time in the tent and outdoors next year. We'll see how all that works out. Hopefully the worst will be far behind us.
Okay, thank you, George and Larry, for clarifying so much
Thank you.
about history and bringing back memories of our great adventure. In a day or two, you in the audience will be able to get a recording of this. If you missed it, you will be able to just share a link with your friends or watch it over again. And you can also sign up for upcoming shows in that e-blast that you'll get in 2 days. Speaking of what comes next, in December, Larry returns with the virtual Chautauqua in Miracle Mongers and Their Methods, the American Medicine Show, Tuesday, December 14th at 7 p.m. Experience a historic recreation of the medicine show's Pitchman's Act, good for what all that ails you. And with Larry Bounds, you know it will be magical. Discover the story of America's early commercialization of pharmaceuticals. Touring medicine shows brought entertainment and hope of better health, but what cost? Millions of dollars were made and the side effects are still evident today. Does it sound familiar? Thank you also. A couple more notes from our audience. Thanks to you, Larry and George. Glad I turned in tonight. That's from Elizabeth Samples. Betty Parker Ellis says, love Greenville Chautauqua. Thank you so much for sharing its origins and story. From Seth, some emoji that I can't see that well. Thank you so much to Charity Rouse and Kristen Bennett from the Spartanburg Library, who keep our virtual world going. And remember, there are always more questions than there are answers. So be the one to ask the questions. Good night, Larry and George, and all of you Chautauquans.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you,